Why can't North Americans do prog? Or can they? Hi, it's Chris. Welcome back to another video. I'm not a massive prog fan, but I'm guessing you're here because you probably are. And when I think about prog rock, I think about King Crimson and Yes, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Genesis. I think about those bands, all British bands. So can North Americans actually do prog, or is it something that's exclusively British/European? Now, it's often considered British, and I think prog rock, progressive rock, is mainly associated with Britain because some of the unique cultural, historical, musical factors that helped it flourish here in the UK. Now, while prog rock developed worldwide, its biggest pioneers, its most influential bands, and its defining characteristics were shaped, I think, here in the UK. And I'm just going to share possibly some thoughts around why that was the case. Firstly, the kind of traditional British musical traditions that we had here. So prog rock leans heavily into European classical music, and Britain has a long history of integrating orchestration, symphonic structures, Baroque influences into popular music. Many prog musicians, Tony Banks I think might be an example of that, had formal training or exposure certainly to classical music, to jazz, making them more inclined maybe towards that kind of complexity and that experimentation. And then there was the folk traditions here in the UK, and certainly bands like Jethro Tull would have been influenced by that. But we also had a very strong art school culture here in the UK, and that had a massive role in shaping prog musicians. Now, many British rock artists, Bowie, Townsend, people in Roxy Music, came from art colleges, and that's a place that I think encouraged experimentation, complexity, and a kind of more avant-garde approach to music. And that intellectual, that artistic environment fostered the conceptual and maybe literary depth that defined prog rock. And then there was the British psychedelic scene as well. So into the late 60s, that psychedelic explosion here in the UK with Soft Machine and Pink Floyd, Sgt. Pepper. And that encouraged musical compositions to be longer, to experiment with sonic kind of sounds. And that naturally evolved into prog rock. Pink Floyd, I think, really bridged the gap really well between psychedelia and fully fledged prog, for example. Now, many early prog bands, King Crimson, Yes, Genesis, they were very influenced by the Beatles and their willingness to experiment with song structures and studio techniques, sonic explorations, if you like. So, did the UK also just have the right kind of music industry? Did it have the right labels? Labels like Charisma with Genesis and Harvest with Pink Floyd and Island with ELP and King Crimson? Were they more willing to invest in unconventional experimental music? And did the live scene here in the UK encourage that complexity? So there was quite a thriving club and certainly university circuit that all the bands did, and that gave prog bands a chance to refine their complex music before they went mainstream. And I think in contrast, maybe North American rock culture leans much more towards radio-friendly, blues-based, straight-ahead hard rock kind of stuff, a little bit more. So there are a few reasons, I think, why it's been less dominant in North America compared with the UK and parts of Europe. And I do think that American rock traditionally has emphasised the kind of folk, country, blues roots, leading to much more kind of straightforward songwriting, a 4/4 approach, if you will. And I think the music industry in North America probably favoured, as I said, those radio-friendly, hit-driven formats, whereas prog rock is quite often about long, complex compositions, and that doesn't really fit that mould. So some of the earliest prog bands are like Yes, King Crimson, Genesis, Pink Floyd, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, they're all British. And they set a very high standard that maybe was difficult to match from bands from North America. North American bands were also leaning into other genres as well. So some of the bands that might have gone full prog actually mixed with other styles. So if we think about Rush, for example, who mixed prog with kind of hard rock, Kansas and Styx that mixed a kind of more radio-friendly kind of sound with prog rock. Frank Zappa, he very much leaned into experimental rock and jazz fusion. The Grateful Dead, long experimental passages, but much more in a kind of a jam band kind of context. So would you say that American prog just gets overlooked? Or do you think it never had the same appeal? Or could they just not do it? Now, whilst North America didn't produce as many iconic bands like the UK did, there's probably some fairly notable ones. So Kansas, for example, who blended symphonic prog with more kind of heartland rock, if you like. But, a band that certainly, I think, in lots of occasions sounded proggy. Icarus, Born on the Wings of Steel, there's a prog song for you. Carry On Wayward Son, though, Dust in the Wind, two of their biggest songs, very American sounded. Would we have taken them more seriously as a prog band if they hadn't produced those? So, Carry On Wayward Son is a complex song. It's lyrically complex as well. It just sounds American. Is that the problem? Maybe with the snobbery here in the UK. Styx, they had very strong prog elements early on. Think Grand Illusion, Equinox, before shifting to an arena rock. Frank Zappa, mentioned earlier, avant-garde jazz fusion, complex compositions. Utopia, Todd Rundgren's band, this is his album Ra, full-on prog before he went to play much more kind of pop rock. Bands like Starcastle, this is their debut from 76. Often compared with Yes, sound just like Yes. Intricate instrumentations on this album, another one called Fountains of Light. Dixie Dregs, the band with Steve Morse, who was in Deep Purple, incredible musicianship but very jazz fusion like. And of course Rush as well, with their the Necromancer, for example, Didax and Narpets, real prog sounding stuff. So let's try and define prog. Now, I think prog, progressive rock, is a genre of rock music that's characterised by complex song structures, experimental compositions, a fusion of diverse musical influences that include jazz and classical and avant-garde. Now, emerging in, the late 60s and flourishing certainly in the early 70s, prog rock pushed beyond that standard verse-chorus kind of approach. So let's think about the key characteristics of prog rock. Firstly, what I've mentioned already, complex song structures, songs that have multiple movements, tempo changes, extended instrumental sections. Prog rock also has unusual time signatures quite often. So rather than 4/4, we might look at 5/4, 7/8, and so on. Prog rock very much defined by virtuoso musicians, probably more keyboard than guitar, but certainly virtuoso musicians. There's also that concept album approach, that storytelling kind of approach, an overarching theme or narrative. Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, good example of that. Maybe a big use of synthesizers and orchestration, heavy use of mellotron and orchestral arrangements. Maybe also in prog rock we've got a blend of genres, classical, jazz, folk, influences from electronic music. That's all common, as are like the fantasy and sci-fi and philosophical themes, especially in the lyrics, which explore things like mythology and dystopias and so on. So with that in mind, with those factors in mind, can North Americans actually do prog? Or is it quintessentially a British thing that North Americans just dabbled in? So let's think about the factors I've just talked about. So complex song structures. So many North American bands, I think, really embraced complex song structures, often moving beyond the typical verse, chorus, verse kind of approach. Now, whilst, yes, Genesis, King Crimson, they did certainly pioneer that complex arrangement. In classic prog, I think there's also some North American bands that used very intricate multi-section compositions. So Frank Zappa springs to mind, and there's a song that he did, what's it called now? It's a 20-minute kind of epic, Billy the Mountain. That's like a rock opera with kind of multiple movements and sections to it. And he was renowned for really complex, difficult pieces of music. Kansas, a band that blended symphonic prog complexity with North American hard rock kind of sound. So there's a song on here that, in fact, it's the title track, Song for America, which is a 10-minute epic with symphonic passages. From this album, Left Overture, from 76, the album that spawned Carry On Wayward Son, we've got Magnus Opus with 5-6 different sections to it, multi-section instrumental with shifting dynamics. Miracles Out of Nowhere alternates between acoustic and heavy prog sections. Styx were a much more kind of radio friendly band in many ways, but certainly had moments of very ambitious structure. Prelude 12, Sweet Madame Blue, from this album from Equinox, certainly has that. On the Grand Illusion, Come Sail Away, it's a ballad that transforms into like a prog rock anthem. Another track on here, Castle Walls, it's dark and it's theatrical and it has orchestral elements. Todd Rundgren, he certainly had a knack for lengthy experimental proggy composition. So this is Utopia, the debut from Todd Rundgren's Utopia, which has a 14-minute theme called Utopia, which definitely has multi-section parts to it. Side B is a 30-minute song called The Icon, which shifts through multiple moods and multiple styles. So we also have in prog unusual time signatures like 7/8/5/4 and so on, often associated with British bands, of course, but some North Americans also experimented with complex rhythms. You know, we mentioned Frank Zappa a moment ago. One of the most complex, rhythmically complex musicians in rock history. He often used, odd meters and polyrhythms and really abrupt time changes in his music. Peaches on Regalia shifts between 7/8 and 4/4. It's a really good example of that. This band, Kansas, there's a track on here called, I mentioned earlier, didn't I, on Left Overture, Miracles Out of Nowhere. That's got 4/4, 7/8, 6/8 on it. There's a track on here, third track, it's a quite a fast-paced instrumental called The Spider. That's in 7/8. There's another song on here, Closet Chronicles, that closes off side 1. That's 6/8 and 4/4, I think. And then when you listen to bands like Rush, I don't know if any of you try to keep up with Neil Peart's drumming, but he often incorporated very complex time signatures and polyrhythms. So, Tom Sawyer shifts between 4/4 and 7/8. Quite a lot of changes in his music. La Villa Strangiato, different sections, 5/4, 7/8, 6/8, all very different. Dixie Dregs, Steve Morse's band, jazz fusion with a little bit of country and so on in it. Night Meets Light, that uses 7/8 and 5/8 throughout it. A really complex piece of music. So a real feature of prog rock is also concept albums, but many US bands, North American bands, embrace that concept album idea. Isn't this considered one of the original concept albums? Yeah, it's not necessarily a strict narrative on it, but certainly reflects a journey of love and heartbreak and so on. Certainly, Left Overture by Kansas that I showed earlier, there's definitely their themes of existentialism, fate, adventure and so on. And then we've got Rush 2112, which is this dystopian sci-fi epic that talks about a regime where music was banned. Synthesizers and mellotron, often a feature of prog rock. Now, the mellotron with its kind of haunting orchestral and choral sounds became a real staple of prog rock. But it's far more common in British bands like King Crimson, like Yes, like Genesis, like the Moody Blues, actually. Several did use it, though. So Kansas certainly made use of it in Song for America. And the keyboard player in Styx is also the singer. What's his name? Dennis somebody. He certainly uses it in tracks like Castle Walls, and I think Come Sail Away has some mellotron on it as well. Star Castle that I showed earlier, they've certainly used it on their album Fountains of Light. The Beach Boys, I think there's possibly some mellotron on that as well. And then bands like Blood, Sweat and Tears. Now this was Al Cooper's band that blended a lot of classical and jazz influences into their kind of rock fusion approach, but certainly there's some mellotron in their early recordings. So another feature of prog rock is this idea of blending genres, of taking in folk and classical and jazz influences. Well, didn't Chicago, or as they were called on their first album, Chicago Transit Authority, didn't they blend folk and blues and rock and jazz really successfully on a number of albums? Blood, Sweat and Tears certainly did. Did this band also do it with their violinist, Jerry Goodman? Did they not blend classical and jazz stuff into a more rock format? Santana, did they blend it? Certainly on the first 3 Journey albums, the band that was spawned from 2 members of Journey, Neil Schon and Greg Rowley, certainly their first 3 albums are quite proggy. There's a song on their 3rd album next called Nickel and Dime, 10 and 5. And it's played in 10 and 5 times. And there's elements of Tom Sawyer there. And there's some stuff that sounds exactly like Xanadu, recorded at the same time as Xanadu by Rush. The closing track on here, I'm Gonna Leave You, is full-on prog. And the album, which was recorded by their real radio-friendly band, get the glare off that. This was a soundtrack to a Japanese film. This is Dream After Dream. 3 vocal tracks on here. The rest is really sort of proggy fusion-y sounding. So is it a British phenomenon, a non-American thing, or could they actually do prog rock, North Americans? The trouble is maybe with North American prog rock is it sounds American. Is that the thing that gets in the way of us snobby Brits? And in the end, does it really matter? For me, no. It doesn't matter at all. Do you like it? Yes or no? Yes, I do. So it doesn't really matter. And all said and done, if I'm really honest, I think I do prefer the kind of North American approach to prog through bands like Kansas and Styx and Rush than I do the British stuff. So tell me what you think in the comments below. Is it a quintessentially British thing, or can North Americans actually do a bit of prog? Thanks for watching, and I'm sure I'll be back sometime soon with another video. Cheers.